I'm your host, Tim Wood. Welcome to The Natural You, where we'll be interviewing guests from different backgrounds and all walks of life to discuss our relationship with nature and how we can better connect to the natural world, both in us and around us. Nature already has all the answers we need to be healthier and happier in all aspects of our lives. Listen up to hear how to access more of The Natural You. This episode, we're going to be talking about sex and intimacy with sex therapist Hannah Elliott. Hannah initially trained as an addiction counselor and now is a qualified psychosexual and trauma therapist. She works exclusively with women in her UK practices, which are in Surrey and London, and online for her international clients. Hannah's practice has a strong emphasis on the mind-body connection, particularly with reprogramming the subconscious landscapes to reclaim a better relationship with oneself, both sexually and relationally in the body. Her approach draws on both Western and Eastern modalities, with esoteric and energy medicine at the core of her work. Hi everyone, today it's our Valentine's special, so I want you to turn down the lights and put on the Barry White, because we've got our psychosexual therapist, Hannah Elliott, in, and she's going to help us reconnect to our natural selves in terms of our sex lives and our intimacy, and perhaps dealing with some of the taboos that we have in our relationships and some of the challenges that we may face as we go along in our lives, and certainly in the different phases of life. I think these perhaps throw up some different challenges. So welcome, Hannah. I'd love you to tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your journey and how you came into this fairly, what I would think, unique field.
Thank you. Hello, Tim. Thank you for inviting me. Where to begin? It's always an interesting question. Well, I studied as an addiction counsellor very early on in life. And I think throughout my professional career and development, it's always been led by my personal life. So I grew up around addicts. So not surprisingly, I got interested in addiction from both lenses. And later down life, I really noticed how I struggled with certain aspects that I cover now, intimacy, but also what was going on in my body during relationships, but then also on my own. And that really just became a curiosity. And I moved to Thailand and spent quite a long time there and practiced a lot of sort of energy-based modalities. I was around a tantra scene. I wasn't too active in it. And so I guess what shapes me and makes me today as a therapist is this dual lens and dual cultural influences, because I feel there's a big difference between East and West. And then coming back to the West, all my friends that had trained as psychotherapists, counselors and whatnot just said, why don't you just study to be a psychotherapist? And psychosexual therapist. And I didn't realize that was a thing until I started looking into it. And it really did speak to me. And so I think it's interesting when therapists study. Maybe not everyone will agree with this, but you sign up for more than a course. It takes you on a very deep dive as well. So yeah, personal, I guess, has always led my professional. There you go. And somehow, hopefully, it balances out.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds like a fascinating, trying to blend the West and the more medical model, and dealing with the labeling and then treating the labels, as opposed to perhaps the Eastern side and looking at the more energetic based things and perhaps more intuitive side, I'm guessing. So that must be a fairly hard balancing act. Or do you just find that just comes naturally to you?
I think I find it comes naturally to me. I suppose once it's almost like you become what you do, if you really love it and it continues to be your purpose and passion. And I guess what I meant with regards to the Eastern traditions is not necessarily any school of thought or religion or spiritual practices per se. I mean, of course, we derive our information potentially from that. But I guess the East, they have a natural way of mind-body connection.
Yeah.
And, they're sort of perhaps slower in their lifestyles. in their practices amongst working, growing food, eating the food. And I feel that kind of brings an individual into a certain resonance. And now we've got so much available to us in terms of yoga practices, schools, teachers, and mindfulness, is huge now in all sorts of aspects, in corporations, corporate, etc. And I think it's great. And I really, truly believe, after my own journey of coming from here, from the West, let's say, with my own story and trauma and certain ways of working, that it was really medicine to be landing back into the body, connecting with the breath, understanding how to regulate oneself, and the clarity that then comes from that. So therefore you've got that kind of online innate intuition that comes available to you, essentially by slowing down first and foremost. And so when I came to do my work, I felt, because that was, a decade of that in practice, and I'd been learning it and somewhat starting to practice it, because I did yoga therapy for women before I did psychosexual work. And in my own journey, it really was the healing that I needed. And now we hear a lot about vagus nerve and, nervous system. So it's really great, because ultimately that kind of is what these spiritual teachings are talking about, right? They just didn't have the language for it then.
Yeah.
And I love how the West have to have, really intelligent language for it. And we have to have, scientific research. And I guess over there it's just lived and practiced, and it's hardwired within their DNA. So it comes through in a different way.
And so do you find that here in the West, and when you're practicing, there's that mind-body connection, there's a disconnection, dissociation, and does that feed into your work, and how do you then reconnect people or make them aware of that? I'm very curious about how you do that.
Well, yeah, most definitely. That, I believe, is certain. It's often the core of the work, and so clients will come and they will present with all different reasons for coming to therapy. It might be intimacy issues within a relationship. It might be they don't know how to get into intimacy. And then furthermore, when we come into the more physicality of it, the body, dysfunction. So, for example, common themes I see in females is lack of arousal, lack of desire, but even more into that, the sense that vaginal tightening, so pain on penetration, burning sensations, and that will even be before any touch of either sexual organs or hands or toys, etc., are introduced. And so there's, I guess, in that lens, you can already see there's a psychology that's flagging up the pain sensors, so to speak, before they've even come in. And also, there's normally a lot of stress and anxiety and despair of, oh gosh, is this going to ruin the relationship, or am I never going to be in a relationship? And so again, we've kind of go up into the head, and all of the energy is there, and we're forgetting to breathe. So we're all shallow breathing. So the breath is lacking down in that sort of lower triangle, as I call it, stagnation. And of course, with the stagnation and lack of oxygen, we are going to create inflammation, which then can be pain. And so within the sessions, the idea is to track that and then slowly and gently introduce individuals into coming back to a connection with the body, first and foremost, for themselves.
And is that done through, obviously the breath that you mentioned, and are there any other kind of techniques that people can explore for themselves in doing that? So there's a lot of, obviously, a lot of things around and different breathing techniques, but if you could give just a little snippet of something that people can practice and how to embody that.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, well, I guess that's something else I learned from training in long breath modalities, and they're thinking, well, I can't use a whole hour to do breath. They want to blast off and shout, talk it out in this safe space that they've luckily enough found. So it comes down to, find something that really allows you to feel soothed. And some people don't even know what that might be to them. And so I kind of go a little bit further in the sense of, maybe it's you getting a cup of tea and you just put your phone in the kitchen and you sit and you look out the window and you just have that, and notice how that breath, that sigh just offers a little moment there where the body says, oh, I'm safe enough just to sit and sigh. And
really,
it can be walking for some people. It can just be having a bath. And again, that might even bring up too much for some clients, actually. But find something that just allows you to feel calmer.
Yeah, so that's really at the root of it, is just kind of bringing people down from that hyper stress, that hyperstimulation of the stress response, and just bringing it down into that parasympathetic soothing. And I guess soothing comes safety,
Exactly.
and with safety allows people to be able to allow other people in. How could you let anyone into your space, into that, if you don't feel safe?
Correct. And exactly that. And that's often why we're working simultaneously with offering references of soothing this nervous system in sessions, in a held space. And then the psychology, the talk therapy aspect of it is to understand the dynamics at play and what is it that's preventing them from feeling safe and finding that language or just that practice within themselves, to sit and have a cup of tea, because, a lot can come up when you're asked to sort of sit in stillness,
Yeah.
So that is a factor, most definitely. As you say, when we're working with the nervous system, the safety aspect, and that's not necessarily a mental concept.
No,
it's dual, isn't it?
And do you think in the way I was brought up, and I'm assuming very similar to a lot of other people who are listening, sex was never really talked about. Maybe you were lucky enough to get a birds and the bees conversation from your parents. Maybe you picked up things at school, or but it was really, it's not something we talked about. And do you think that's part of the driver, as the kind of the taboo aspect, or do you think it's perhaps more societal general traumas from childhood trauma, or things like that? It's a very general question, but
yeah, I would have to say that I think it's all of the above, and it's then case dependent for that individual to identify what it is that is keeping them somewhat conditioned, somewhat suppressed, to finding what their truth is. And I think that's something that I found very early on in this as well, was, our sexuality and our sexual energy is indeed individual. We are individuals regardless of any of that. And yet society, even from the school age, we're all told wear the uniform, same subjects, etc. And nowadays, of course, things are changing. We're seeing a lot more freedom of expression.
Yeah.
But I guess the generations before us, we were kind of told what box to fit in and how to do it.
Yeah.
And indeed, how to not do it, perhaps, without any real education or indication of what it really entails.
And just thinking about those sort of transition points for perhaps children moving into adolescence and adolescence into early adulthood, and those transition points and the lack of guidance. So perhaps in a more natural or indigenous-based culture, there would be the women that would take the young girls off and say, look, these are the things that are happening. These are the roles that maybe our culture expects, and this is how you deal with them. And the same for the men, taking those young boys off to some kind of initiation and say, right, when you're moving into this, a lot of those, you weren't even allowed to really think of having a girlfriend or a boyfriend until you had been through those, because the society would determine, okay, you're physically and maybe emotionally ready to start doing that. Whereas now it's just a free for all, and you just off you go.
Of course. Absolutely. We've lost a lot of that old traditions, like you say, rites of passage, initiations, really recognizing the stages of manhood, womanhood, and then finding as well, what do we look for in partners and why? So it's again, I have a sort of dual opinion on that, because I guess I'm always encouraging freedom of expression and finding a true self. And yet, of course, we've got so many influences now that are somewhat disorientated and distorted social medias and pornography, etc. And it only gives one way of perhaps coming together.
Yeah, and I think I mean, we touched on it in our earlier discussion, pornography and the easy access, and just, you know, you can just click a button and have you know, videos of whatever. And does that, maybe, have you found that an influence in your work, or have you seen trends in your colleagues' works, or how psychology is dealing with that? Or is there any fallout from that? Or
Well, I guess that's always been an awareness in this industry of what influences are porn having. And I guess what comes to mind is when we were talking earlier on about how we're sort of overstimulated at the level of the mind, that busyness. And we are an overstimulated culture, I believe. And so when we're thinking of porn, and it's really done in that overstimulated way, where as we're more overstimulated, we actually lose connection with the rest of the senses, if that makes sense. And so it is a very hedonistic, ego orientated influence that we're getting, rather than working with the senses on what does that feel like, what does that sound like. And of course that again then encourages us to slow down, to hear those sounds, to feel those feelings and touches, etc. So I'm not surprised that porn and alike have got such a strong hold and influence now, because indeed we're addicted to that level of stimulation, I believe.
Okay, so that ties in with your earlier addiction work. Is so is the remedy for that to bring in the other senses? And so are there some kind of, is there, like I'm going to say a recipe, but is there some kind of, not protocols, but some ideas you can give couples to help bring back some intimacy into that, and what would be ideas that in a safe way for people to explore that?
Sure. Well, some of it comes back to the old-fashioned stuff, you know, whining and dining. And I don't mean you have to drink wine and dine, but it is, you know, like, let's put some music on, let's change the lighting, let's not put the telly on straight away, let's allow each other to come in from work, you do you, I'll do me, you know, then we meet on the sofa and kind of connect at the same energy, like the same frequency, so to speak. How was your day? Look at each other in the eyes. Dress nicely, even to sit on the sofa. Keep your phone in the other room, and be really present with each other. Try and see each other like you did in the beginning. You know, making that little extra effort that we forget, and we get busy and we take it for granted. I guess that would be one thing. And then more so in psychosexual practices, we do work with something called sensate focus. So couples that, you know, perhaps are coming up with some lack of arousal, lack of desire, or any other of the issues that we mentioned earlier on, that slow it down, start from the beginning again, and sort of relearn what touch is good and what touch isn't so good for you. Getting to re-explore, and again it requires us to slow down. So this is why it's so easy to avoid.
And listening and sharing.
Yeah.
So
sharing.
like, if there is, it's like, what touch is good, express that maybe, and what touch isn't good, express that. You know, I wonder if if that obviously plays a role. So setting the mood, right?
Setting the mood, indeed, and also feeling that you can be asked. You know, somebody says, how, you know, your partner asks you how you know, how are you feeling? How are you doing? That you feel that you are going to be heard, and vice versa. And I see that often what has got lost along the line is communication. Feeling that I can say how I'm feeling without him rolling his eyes or her rolling her eyes going, oh yeah, I'm really tired for this conversation right now. Because actually that shuts that person down, that nervous system down, and that goes into that lower region again. It's just this kind of contraction.
So it's down to that old like all relationships, right? It's down to communication, whether it's individual or group, and sharing that. And I suppose that changes in different relationships and different stages of life. I remember chatting to someone a long time ago, and he said the couples have usually three major conflict points, and that's childcare, money, and sex. Obviously kids put a completely different dynamic into that kind of thing, but those are classical touch points, or challenge points for so many relationships. And obviously when the kids are around, there's a huge different change in priority for most couples. And then I'm thinking of as the kids get older, I'm seeing as the kids are starting to leave home, maybe the parents are now moving into middle age, and kind of classically, particularly the men, there's this sort of middle age crisis where they want to go and find someone 20 years younger, or an old flame, or whatever it may be. Is that a physical thing? Is it like, obviously women have menopause and men's testosterone levels fluctuate and things like that. I'm sure those play a role. Is it seen as a very physical or physiological thing, just like adolescence is? Or is it kind of seen more in psychological terms, or again, is it a bit of blend of both?
Well, it's a really good question. And what I find a lot of people aren't aware of, that the men have andropause, which is essentially their menopause. And I think that's even more or less spoken about and taboo than the menopause. And so it's this kind of sneaky thing that just sneaks up on you, and then you're just meant to deal with it in the moment. But indeed, it is hormonal related. And I suspect as well from...
Could you just to interrupt, can you, just before we go into that, can you just give us some of the kind of things that might show up for men in that way, sort of symptoms or pictures that might, things that might happen to guys?
Yeah. So I guess chemistry changes in terms of their internal chemistry, and testosterone will go lower, and that generally activates a sense of, you kind of relate it to being a bit more grumpy.
Okay.
And indeed it will potentially change the physiological function of the man. And that has a real escalating impact when it's new territory, and communication hasn't been as great as it could have been in the last few years, let's say, and or focus has been on kids and earning and providing, etc. That then men are meant to be all vulnerable and go, oh, hang on a minute, how am I meant to find a language to speak about this, my masculine self?
And we weren't that good at to start with, and now we're grumpy on top of it.
There you go. So I think it's a hard trip at the moment. I say at the moment because I feel that there's something interesting going on with the sexes, but that's another story for another time potentially.
Yeah.
But I think there's a real limited awareness and any sense of support. Women have found their way back into community, have found their way back into gathering and talking and having that natural environment of counselling, essentially. And men have, come together in alcohol-infused environments potentially, and encouraged to be male providers, macho. Vulnerability is a real new current of energy for them to be exploring.
Yes, and we've my friend and I, Glenn, run some men retreats called Cairo Wild, and we see that. Amazing. But when we take those men out of their lives and put them in with the other guys, and then particularly in nature, it seems to allow them to kind of tap into that, and without having anyone else or knowing that it's a safe space, they can go there. So I think it is there, and I think perhaps
that's amazing.
We need to do more as men to create that safe space for each other.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I'd love to see that grow more so. And that's amazing work, so needed, I think, and brilliant.
Fantastic. And so we were kind of to kind of go back, I took you off track there. Going back into sort of menopause and midlife crisis, we were kind of heading off the midlife crisis thing.
Yeah.
I think we were talking about, and I diverted you to andropause.
Yeah. Andropause. Well, no, this is it. The awareness around that, I think, is really key. I guess there's something else, isn't there, that's going on at that stage of life potentially for both the individuals in the relationship, as they've worked hard all their life and they're getting to tune in now to, what would one might do when we start to retire, when we have more time, when we can almost recreate an identity for ourselves. Because identity, in, I guess, as it seems, is that we become our work, our job, our roles to provide and take care of the children and the house, etc. And we potentially lose ourselves a little bit in that. And it's quite daunting to then come back into this arena where we've got space, we've got time, and we've essentially hardwired ourselves to be addicts to the busyness, addicts to the fast pace, where we just can't drop into that. And I guess that's potentially a symptom of the way that our Western culture is just so busy, and we value the materialistic and that desire to keep being bigger and better and more. And then, of course, once you're coming into retirement, you're essentially winding down with no framework, no guidance, no idea. And you look around at your partner and you go, well, who are you? Who are you, but who am I?
Yeah, there's when you say that materialistic element, I've looked at some work where they talk about pathoadolescence. And so if we look at sort of more the Native American stages of life, when we go to adolescence and then early adolescence, late adolescence, and then early adulthood, late adulthood, and then into eldership and all the way around. So sort of from birth to death around the wheel. And this kind of way of thinking is saying that our Western society gets stuck in what they call pathoadolescence. And so if you think of an adolescent's drive towards, having things and being popular and having sex and doing all these things, and it's very much being aggressive. And, if you look at most of our world leaders or big businessmen, they're just stuck in that, right? So you got the 60-year-old guy driving around in the sports car, which every 20-year-old wants, right? But never has. And so we're just stuck at that stage. And so they never get through to the next stages where the true adults can actually lead and guide, and then elders can then look back and do the same. And it's it ties into that materialist comment you made that made me think of that. So it's almost like, that's why I was thinking of this different stages of life and how that's really important in adolescence, to have that fire and that passion and that drive, because that's very natural, isn't it?
Indeed.
But is it natural to try and keep that alive? You see this drive towards youthfulness, and you look at celebrities trying to get younger and younger, and it's just ridiculous. Instead of other people just embracing and going, yeah, I dig my grey hair, or that's just and the wisdom that's coming with that. And so I just I wonder how that plays into what we think we should be doing sex-wise. It's like
sure. Well, what came to mind there when you were saying that was just about that lack of integration of all of the different stages. So I feel, that, like you say there in Native American or certain traditions where they really value and look up to the elders and the wise ones, and yet we almost brush them aside and disrespect and leave them to be isolated, living in their care
you've retired.
homes.
You literally retired from life, So you must now go and play and try and get back what you had, and what they call pasture and playtime. So you go off to pasture and you can go and play golf and fishing and whatever it is. And that's you done. Instead of taking all those that knowledge and wisdom and allowing that to filter back and allowing them to actually guide the adults, and then the adults can kind of guide the youth, and that comes full circle. So it's just, I say, that's a lost opportunity. And
lost opportunity indeed. And again, like you say, that so we are essentially programmed to fear getting older, getting to those stages. So of course, then grasping onto what one might make themselves feel more attractive, more validate themselves a bit more with the lovely car and the etc. And again, so that integration, I'm thinking about it from that external way, but then also as individuals, there's so much that we go through in life where we don't sort of stop, process and integrate, and therefore it becomes an extension of us rather than a separation from us. And that then becomes the distortion that comes in the room. You know, it's like my body isn't doing what I want. It feels like it's separate from me, for example.
Yeah. And so how would we recognize that within ourselves? So it's tough, but if someone is out there going, "Oh, I'm fine," what kind of questions could we ask ourselves to see, well, where am I not integrating, and how am I expecting myself to be something from the past, or not loving where I'm at right now in this phase, which is the best phase ever, right? Because each phase brings its own beauty and we look at a little kid who's just totally innocent, and it's like the best phase ever, and then we see a wise old person who just seems to just be content and just sit and look at it all and go, it's perfect, and that's the best stage ever as well. So each stage brings its own beauty and perfection. And so if we can, perhaps, what kind of questions might we ask ourselves where we are now to help us recognize where we're not integrating?
Good question. Again, I guess it's going to be case dependent, but I wonder, often for me, I always find that when the body is coming out of its balance, i.e. a symptom, a rash, sleep disturbances, whatever is coming in that's showing up as a potential signal, something somewhere is not in balance. And we're multifaceted, aren't we, with our physicality, but then our emotional mind, our unconscious mind, which is, again, why psychosexual therapy is there. It's to help understand the unconscious mind, bring it conscious, and hopefully that then resolves and it acts as an integration. So I guess to answer that question in a bit more simpler terms, I guess I would ask the individuals, do they feel happy? Do they feel healthy? Do they feel in harmony? And that can be with anything, with work, relationship, with body, with sleep, with how they spend their free time.
That's such a good question. I don't ask that. Do you feel in harmony? And that's just so, I talk about discord and things like that, but in harmony is just so nice. And if I think of when you say listen to your body, and what body signals are you getting? So you really have to start observing and say, okay, right, if I do have a rash, if it's not a cream I'm putting on me or some irritant, it's coming from somewhere.
Sure.
And the skin really represents our internal state really a lot. And a lot of our kind of modern conditions are all inflammatory based, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's from being in the stress state, because when we're in the sympathetic or stressed state, our body prepares for inflammation. So if you were going to face off on the tiger, then your chemistry actually starts preparing you to be injured so that it can heal quickly. And the first part of healing is inflammation. And that's under the sympathetic control. But the next phases of healing, which are about repairing that tissue and bringing it back to new, is under the parasympathetic.
Indeed.
So if we're always in sympathetic dominance in our lives, in our minds, when we're supposed to be resting and be hyperstimulated, as you mentioned earlier, and addicted to all the stimulation, we're in this hyper arousal, hyperstimulated state, and that is pro-inflammatory. So it's driving inflammatory processes. So until we can say, okay, that's good if you're going to have some trauma, because you want to be ready for that, but then we need to come down and bring in the vagus nerve we mentioned, the parasympathetic, and that's the rest and digest, and the second and third phases of healing, which is all about the regeneration of that tissue. So if we're constantly in that sympathetic state, being stressed, we have to neurologically be in an inflamed state. So if you have an inflammatory or an autoimmune type disease, like huge percentage is going to be driven by sub and unconscious stresses.
Absolutely.
And I guess that's where just saying, okay, I have that, maybe I need to seek a non-physical therapy for that. So yeah, you can put on some cream onto your rash, but if there's an underlying issue, then maybe you need to talk to a professional about tapping into those, because it's not going to resolve on its own, is it?
Absolutely. Well, I read something the other day and it really landed with me, just about, what is it? We're made up of like 99.9 energy molecules. And so I guess at the root of all of this, in terms of, all of these things help us along our journey with body work, talk therapy, etc. But I'm really curious in my sort of later time now in practice and personally, just about the energy of emotions. And most of them are unconscious until we, like you say, find ourselves either having signals on the body and or, I don't know, perhaps by chance we're in a conversation and it comes out and you go, woof, I didn't even realise I felt like that. Or somebody challenges you and says, oh, are you aware that you're always saying how much you hate your husband or wife or something like that, and it's like, oh, really? It's become an automatic. So yeah, there's a lot there. I think I've lost track now of where we were with our original question.
Energy of emotion.
Oh yes.
And so yeah, it's an interesting concept. So emotion carries an energetic signal or energetic component.
Yeah, energetic frequency, let's say. Okay. And I think it's fair to say that we're all made up of multiple frequencies, right?
Yeah.
And when we're kind of carrying that sort of emotional trauma or emotional distress, and people say it as a thing. Oh, they've got a good vibe. That actually really is true in its form. They carry a good frequency,
and it ties into in harmony because when we're in coherence.
Yeah.
So we know that the heart gives off electromagnetic frequency, which can be felt, meters away, whereas your brain's electromagnetic frequency can only be measured sort of centimeters away.
Right.
And so there are studies from the Heart Math Institute that show that when we are in heart coherence with person or people around us. So I'm just wondering how heart coherence and setting the mood could help us bring back into our heart space, which is where where most cultures say love comes from, the heart.
Sure.
Valentine's Day, we're going to see hearts everywhere.
Yeah.
Because the heart is where that comes from. So if we go into heart coherence, setting the mood allows us to breathe, come down, let our hearts start to relax and start to open, and allow us to go into heart coherence with the people around us. And then, like you say, when we start to connect at that level, then you're setting the scene. And that, and then intimacy is you're intimately connected at a frequency level.
And exactly that. And then I would also add, and this might not be relevant or could go off somewhere else, but if you look at, if you're familiar with acupuncture, which I guess most people are nowadays, we are very aware that, perhaps the liver will be connected to the emotion of anger and frustration, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But what's not so commonly spoken about is the sexual organs and the acupuncture or the reflexology acupuncture points that exist there. So on the vulva, the labia, the internal cavity, the head of the penis is in fact the heart.
Wow.
The cervix
I did not know that.
is the heart. And so if you think about when we're anatomically putting these two together, this is obviously going on heterosexual couples.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it applies in all mixed sexualities as well. And So we think about that sort of heart and heart coming together at the level of the sexual
Sexual
organs.
organs.
Well,
Wow.
it is going to bring up stuff because, of course, we're curious. Well, why does all this come up in romantic relationships and not with my best friend Sandra?
Yeah.
Because, there's something else going on there, a different energy connection, you could say, which obviously has its vehicle through the physical and then the emotional. Complex.
Hugely complex.
Yeah.
I'm trying to take notes here, and I'm losing my pen's running out of ink. Yeah, so that physical, and I think, we all know it. That sex and intimacy is always physical and emotional, and it's that connection. And I can only speak for myself, but I think after being intimate and having a sexual experience, I just feel so much more connected to myself. I just feel so much centered. I feel so much more able, and if I'm not there, then I can feel frustrated and edgy. I'm just a bit more grumpy, as I'm sure my wife will concur. So, tying in that physical emotional element is really interesting. And I've spoken to older couples in their 70s and 80s, and I've heard different views. Some people go like, well, we're 80 and we still have sex, or I'm still looking forward to that. And I've heard others said that, oh no, at 60 we got separate beds and that was it. Can't be dealing with that anymore. And I when I heard that, I wasn't very happy. But I think there's those different ways of dealing. I just wonder how couples who at that age just kind of go, okay, well, we're old enough, we don't need that anymore. And again, I guess the relationship takes a different. They meet their needs in a different way.
Well, hopefully, and again, I guess that's what it comes back to, that cultural conditioning, society's conditioning. What was their program, essentially what they were raised upon? So if it was, once you're married forever regardless, and watched mum and dad separate in their bedrooms from an earlier, it becomes the norm, and then we don't really question it into our own relationship field. But of course, and then there's that aspect of finding other areas of intimacy and connection and companionship, and if that works for both, and if it doesn't, then that's obviously where now we're looking at the rates of divorce and separation being a lot higher, because there is more autonomy potentially where couples can speak now, well, actually, I do need physical intimacy. It's not something that I want to live without. And it's not shamed so much anymore. It's all about sex.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I think we are going through so many changes as well now in terms of the way that relationships are, genders are, sexual preferences are.
Big cultural shift, isn't there, in terms of what's you say we touched on at the beginning. There were kind of a lot of taboos in perhaps early generations, and now those are kind of breaking down, and perhaps it'll swing too far the other way. I don't know, but it seems like these big cultural changes, and the fact that we're having this conversation now, I don't think we would have been having it 20 years ago.
Right.
So yeah, very, very cool.
Yeah.
Hannah, it's been so cool having you on and help us kind of reconnect to ourselves and our natural state, and how sex and intimacy is something we're born to, and it's so important to us as individuals and our culture and our societies. And I'd love for people to have access to some of your experience and knowledge. And is there a way that people can reach you? I know you do online counselling as well for people who are not in the UK. Hannah's based in Surrey and in London, but I know you do some online stuff. Is it okay if I put your details down below in the comments? Okay, so have a look down there if you want to reach out.
Yeah, please do.
I'm sure she can help you help in lots of different ways. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing with us.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Good, brilliant.
Bye.
Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to The Natural You. I hope you got something useful out of this episode. If you think someone might benefit from hearing this, please share it with them. Lastly, I'd love it if you hit the subscribe button and rate and review this podcast. See you next week.